Hi, Alain.
Hello. Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good. Thank you so much.
Let me tell people who we are. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Alain de Botton, famous author. Your books include The Consolations of Philosophy and what is it about Proust?
How Proust can change your life.
Can change your life, and many others. Most recently, Religion for Atheists, just out. And I want to start by asking you how good a metaphor for the project this book is about the design of the book is. And here's what I mean by that, okay? So you've got kind of a Holy Bible thing going on here. There's actually texture. It feels like leather, and it's a separable jacket. And some might say that what the designer has done is cut the very heart out of the Holy Bible, but preserved, or cut the heart out of religion, preserved the texture of religion, and the heart being God in the minds of many religious people. So is that what this is? When you talk about a religion for atheists, are you talking about preserving a lot of the kind of the texture of religion without what some people would call its heart?
Look, my starting point is as a non-believer, as an atheist, and for the last decade or so, being an atheist suggests someone who not only doesn't believe, but also thinks that religion is ridiculous, possibly dangerous. A kind of fierce version of atheism has been doing the rounds. Think of Christopher Hitchens's famous subtitle, Why Religion Poisons Everything. Mm-hmm. I suppose I'm trying to move the debate on, as a non-believer, I'm arguing that religions are intermittently wise, beautiful, complex, subtle, and too important in a way to be abandoned simply to those who happen to believe in them. I argue that therefore, for everyone, I'm saying all that well aware of the problems of religion. As I say, I am an atheist, but nevertheless, I think I'm arguing for an engagement with many of the concepts and rituals of religion.
Okay, and there are a number of examples, I guess. There are things that you think religions do very well that
absolutely
that you would like to import to a project that is not theistic, but you would like that project to accomplish certain things that religions do, right? So I guess there's on the one hand the goals of religion that you think are valid, and there's on the other hand the instruments of religion which you think are effective, right? Those are the two things that you want to move to some different plane.
Look, I guess my starting point is there are things in secular society which are not going that well, and some of those things are amenable to treatment or elucidation or resolution with some insights from religion. It doesn't mean to say that religion is the only source of insights, but in key areas. So let's think about, for example, community. Everyone would accept that religions are phenomenally successful at fostering a sense of community, whereas secular society on the whole is not. Mm-hmm. So it's a typical example of the way that I proceed in the book. I look at how religions go about doing some of that, and I ask a very basic question, which is, what might a non-believer learn from this? It's sometimes simple lessons. It's about functioning as a host. It's about introducing people to one another. It's about using ritual to resolve social conflicts, etc. So, and this is in many areas. There are examples to be picked up, lessons to be picked up.
Okay. Now, some of those in that context are commonly put to use, right? I mean, dinner party hosts. I mean, people exploit the communal properties of dining every day, right? But you're arguing for more than that.
Well, I think we find that in the secular world, there are, of course, gatherings of people every day. In a large city, people gather in museums, in lecture halls, in bars, in restaurants, etc. But what tends not to happen is that journey that religions take you through, which is from stranger to friend, trying to see the shared humanity in people. That effort at empathy remains quite a struggle. It doesn't come naturally to us. We're all aware that there are people who we think, oh, that person looks very strange. I can't imagine I'd have anything in common with them. And religion at its best moments, breaks down some of those silos. And when people drift away from faith, one of the things they tend to say is, I was sorry to see the social aspect go. I was sorry that I couldn't be part of the community anymore. And that seems an uncomfortable choice for me. Why have we been so bad at generating communities? And what might we do to foster them? So in my book, I float a few ideas drawn from religion. I'm impressed by the way that religions break bread together, and the tradition of communal dining seems very important, and so at odds with the very solitary way in which we tend to eat in the modern world, either literally on our own or else within set groups that we know from pre-existing class or work or family networks. So plenty of lessons to be picked up.
Okay. And then there are other realms where you think there are lessons to be picked up. Education is one.
Absolutely.
I gather, you draw a distinction, which is clear enough, actually, between a lecture and a sermon. But I gather you almost think there should be a little more... Are you saying there should be a little more sermonizing in education?
Well, in a sense, I think, again, the religions tend to begin with the notion that humans are vulnerable, confused creatures in need of guidance. Mm-hmm. And that's what they set out to do, to provide a structure which will guide us through the main challenges of life. I'm struck by the way that the secular education system is much cooler, if you like. It's the temperature is less, and the assumption is that life is fundamentally a relatively easy thing to get right, and therefore you don't go to school or university to learn how to live. There are people who read self-help books, but they're stupid people. That's what elite culture teaches us, that those in need, urgent need of guidance, have something a bit wrong with them. And the business of living, the great challenges of life, should be relatively simple. All you have to do is, grow up, start a family, find your way through the working world, face your own mortality, and then put yourself in a coffin at the end of your life. And basically, it's kind of easy. And if you need something else, there might be something wrong with you. That's what the secular world hints at. And I'm just struck by the contrast with religions which, as I say, start from the notion that all of us are only just holding it together and are in need of support. So even though I don't agree with all the support that's on offer, I like that initial starting point, that starting maneuver of the vulnerable self. Mm-hmm. And I search for that analysis in vain in the modern world. In the secular world, you find a little bit in psychoanalysis, of course, but it's otherwise often absent from the structure of education.
Okay, so you're not just, you bemoan the tendency of people to belittle self-help on the one hand, but you're not just suggesting that we change that message and convey to people that it's okay to read the self-help books that are out there. You're also saying that there's something lacking in that genre. Is that right?
Well, I'm struck by the way that when religion started to decline in the countries of Western Europe in the end or the middle of the 19th century, people started to ask, where's the population going to find sources of guidance, ethics, meaning, consolation? Where's that going to come from? And an influential section of the kind of analytical classes came up with a suggestion which still reverberates to this day. They argued that there was something that could replace scripture in the Western imagination, and that thing was culture. So in the famous words of Matthew Arnold, culture could replace scripture. And it was on the basis of that idea that a lot of energy went into the teaching of the humanities. Topics like English literature became university subjects for the first time. And people tended to look towards education as something that could provide some of the same function as religion had once done. Now, I personally think that's a fascinating idea and a good idea. I also am aware that it's not an idea that has much mileage nowadays. People pay lip service to it in the more lyrical passages of graduation ceremonies and politician speeches. But basically, if you showed up at any university in the US or Europe and you said, look, I've come to study how to live, how to be good and how to learn how to live and then die and confront my fears and find consolation, you would be shown the way to the insane asylum. It's just not the way. It's too intense. It doesn't feel mature. It feels too urgent. for a kind of problem for the education system to digest. So again, I contrast that with the way religions proceed.
So what's an example of the way, say, a seminar in English literature should run in a college? What should be said?
Well, I mean, I'm struck by the way in which the major topics of life, as they strike an ordinary citizen, I'm thinking here about, work, love, mortality, anxiety. These things are never studied head on. It's almost like we have a kind of resistance to looking at these things in the face. So we study topics called things like English literature or anthropology or sociology, but that's far removed from the individual and their needs. And again, if you look at the great sermonizing tradition of, say, Christianity, they'll tackle the topics head on. What's the sermon on this week? If you're listening to John Donne, at St. Paul's Cathedral, way back, you'll be hearing sermons on, family, on responsibility to the state, on kindness, on, the needs of the elderly. All of these things are confronted head on in the sermonizing traditions of religion. And again, I'm struck by the distancing effect of the education system. And, look, if I had my way, we might study things under different headings. We might study relationships. No one studies relationships. And yet, goodness knows how much relationships causes difficulties, but they are not systematically studied. We have no organized mechanism for the transmission of wisdom in these humanistic areas outside of religion. We do not transfer wisdom systematically. And that seems bizarre, dangerous, and, a waste of everyone's time.
But that would be one criterion for designing courses in the university of your dreams. Is it succeeding in transmitting wisdom? So you might have a course called Literature and Love instead of 20th century literature or something.
For example, these headings matter, because they guide the material. I'm struck by the way that there's an enormous amount of energy and money that goes into the humanities, and eager students join up every year, and yet, how many of those come away disappointed, and how many graduate programs eject rather disappointed people out into the world, people who are studying these things because essentially they want to know how to live and they want to further wisdom. And yet they discover that the rules of the university system means that they cannot systematically attack the topic of wisdom, that they are forced down rather arcane research patterns. And, this decimates the interest with which many people approach the education system.
And is there also here an implied criticism of art criticism? I found that when you critique art from the point of view of whether it makes people better or worse, that you're derided as hopelessly old-fashioned. But it sounds as if you're saying that that's really what maybe the main way we should think about art and appraise art and distinguish between good art and bad art.
Yes, look, I'm struck by the sheer bizarreness of how religions treat art compared with how the secular world treats art. We tend to think we've got art worked out, a huge amount of surplus capital is devoted to art every year, and you hear it said these days that museums have become our new cathedrals, our new churches. It's a nice idea. In other words, that art can take over some of that function. In theory, yes, but again, rather like with the university system, I find there's a certain ideological structure which takes away from art that capacity that I think it has to fulfill a kind of neo-religious function. So it's important to go back to religions and say, okay, how are these guys looking at art? How are they using it? And the answer is almost shockingly simple. They're using art in a didactic way to remind us of how we might live and to draw us away from how we shouldn't live. In other words, it's a kind of moral, ethical adjunct. And religions believe that we need art because otherwise we forget. We are not sufficiently alive to the important moral messages when they're merely delivered in an intellectual way. So we need the sensory. We need art to evoke for us, to rescue from cliches, lots of things we know in theory, but don't abide by in practice.
And is there, from this point of view, something in contemporary culture, whether movies or music or whatever, something you would call bad art or good art? Something that strikes you as a good example of either?
I think it's the way that it's presented. You know, I remember as a teenager heading off to the Tate Gallery in London and seeing Rothko's famous room that he's got in the Tate, full of these incredibly powerful canvases. And I remember as a teenager thinking, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to feel here. I've heard that Rothko's very important. And I remember looking around for a bit of help from the museum. And the museum had a little caption that told me when Rothko was born and what material he was using on his canvases. It didn't really guide me in knowing how to use that picture as an emotional resource. And then I remember many years later coming across an interview with Rothko in which he declared quite simply that he wanted his work to act as a conduit for the unhappiness, the suffering that all human beings feel, but often feel alone. He wanted it to be a moment of communion around our dark realities. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading this and thinking, goodness, I wish I'd known about that when I was 18. I wish that the Tate had put that on the wall. And again, I think it's not a coincidence they didn't. There's, as I say, a distancing maneuver that very often happens. It's not contemporary artists who are to blame. It's the rather sober way in which the art is presented. And again, I'm just struck by the way in which, for religions, art has an urgent need. You might cry in front of a painting. A painting might be asked to do a very intense piece of work on your own psyche or soul. And, you know, I look around for comparable expectations of art in the contemporary world, in the contemporary museum ideology, and I struggle. And I think that's a pity because it's removing the power of art, both religious art and secular art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have this interesting idea of organizing museums thematically. So one floor would be about, would feature art that's about compassion, and another floor would have another theme, and so on.
That's right, that you could rearrange works of art, not by curatorial academic categories, because at the end of the day, who cares that it was painted in, you know, the Renaissance? Or, you know, what really matters is what's the thing about and what it might do for me. And yet those categories are not allowed to dominate.
Okay. Now, another thing you pay a fair amount of attention to is ritual, which of course is a big part of religion, often not a big part of secular life or the life of an atheist. And, you know, I certainly appreciate the point. You know, I kind of bemoan the lack of ritual in my own life to some extent. But I guess I'm wondering, how do you imagine an actual atheist bringing something comparable to, you know, any kind of coming of age ritual, say bar mitzvah or whatever? What exactly do you imagine the atheists doing with their children that's comparable to that?
Well, first of all, let's take a step back. What is a ritual? For religion, a ritual is a communal event that somehow accomplishes something inner and psychological. And the modern world tends to imagine that our inner developments should bubble up spontaneously, should be the work solely of the individual. And religions disagree. They believe that it's very hard for us to get to some of those important inner states simply on our own. So we need help from the group in order to do something within us privately. And that's an odd sort of starting point, but a fascinating one. I think the best religious rituals accomplish something that is psychologically complex and subtle and touches on our ambivalence. You know, if you take something like the bar mitzvah at one level is a celebration of the maturity of a growing young man. But it's really also a form of mourning for the loss of a child, for his parents.
So say I'm an atheist sitting in my suburban home, and you know, I realize my son or daughter is turning 14 or something. It's an important time. It is some kind of natural threshold. I want to commemorate that and prepare them to face the road ahead and whatever else it is that things like confirmation and bar mitzvah do. What would you recommend? And say I've read your book and I understand the importance of this. Where should I turn? What should I do?
Look, I think
it just seems like if I just invite the neighbors over for this ritual I've made up, that may not meet with you know.
Look, I think to invent a ritual is no less complicated than to write a good play or write a good book or create anything complicated, create a new machine or something. So we're talking about something that needs to be thought about properly. I can't give you an answer in 3 minutes. But all I would say is, firstly, the invention of ritual has not come to an end. Secondly, we need it. And thirdly, we need to give it the time and the intelligence that such a thing requires. I'm struck by the way that frequently in the secular world, we forget the aesthetic side of ritual. So, there are humanist organizations that will offer to marry you and bury you, and thereby replace key functions of religions. But looking at how they go about doing this, I'm struck by how ugly it tends to look, how the language is poor, how the clothes are not quite right. And these sound like superficial details, but religions know they're not. They know that the aesthetic side of life is intimately connected with how plausible and convincing something can be. So I think that atheism generally has done itself a disservice by failing to recognize the role of the aesthetic in both ritual and in concepts more generally.
See, that's the part I'm having trouble importing into an atheistic context, in the sense that, again, if you imagine me inviting the neighbors over, it's one thing to say my daughter's graduating from junior high, we're having a party to celebrate. If I start asking people to wear certain things, or even I and my daughter wear certain things, they're just going to think that's weird.
Sure.
And I think it's partly because when people do wear things, it's part of a long and inherited tradition. It may be associated with actual theistic belief about the significance of the garments, but in any event, it seems like something that's kind of hard to invent out of whole cloth, so to speak.
Look, things definitely acquire a patina of age once they've been around for a long time, so that we can swallow something like Holy Communion as a natural event in a way that we wouldn't when something is a little bit new. But I guess that your starting point is, wouldn't it all seem strange if we did certain things ourselves now? And that seems to me like a fundamentally uncreative starting point. Well, it might seem strange. It might seem fantastic. The world is not, we haven't invented everything that we need. There are clearly aspects of life that need to be tinkered with by atheists. We're still the result of a generation that rejected religion, but on the grounds of the implausibility of certain of its doctrines, without necessarily thinking about many of the secondary things that religion accomplishes. And I think this is going to be the struggle. And, you and I might not work out every aspect of it now, or indeed I don't in my book, but I'm trying to delineate a space where the creativity of forthcoming generations will have to be generated. There are so many areas where people say things like, the church has got one thing right, but pity about the doctrines. Take education. Many parents I know say things like, I'd really like my kids to grow up with a sense of morality and ethics, and a lot of church schools do that well, faith schools do that well, and then they say, yeah, but we don't really want the faith bit because we don't actually believe in the faith, but we wish we could have the morality, so we don't like the choice. Now, at the moment, in many areas, that's the only choice you've got. You've got a kind of looser ethical arrangement in a non-denominational space, or you've got a more ethical structure in a faith-based school. Now, that's a gap in the market, if I can speak in, a vulgar capitalist sense, but why not? Because this is about the catering to needs. There are many needs of the soul which are not properly being catered for. The very fact that we don't know how to marry people properly outside of religions, the fact that religions, are still doing this better than most people. Why does that have to be? I don't see an inherent reason. I think it's just we haven't got around to thinking about it properly. As a society, we're still working it out. It's still very early days. We're at the level of the cottage industry. People are tinkering around. How can I invent a ceremony for my 14-year-old daughter? And sometimes it works, and a lot of the times, it doesn't. But it's a fascinating area. There's so much work to be done.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm partly thinking about some experience I've had with Unitarian churches. Has anybody brought this up with you?
They've mentioned Unitarianism, yeah.
I mean, because Unitarianism, the truth is they really don't have there is no unified Unitarian theological belief. Many Unitarians are, in fact, atheists. In any event, there's no clear-cut belief system per se that's being conveyed at the Unitarian churches I've been to. There is an ethical framework, but there's no theology. And I've largely been struck by how it doesn't work. I mean, how hard it is to organize something like that around a void at the level of actual belief.
Yes, I mean, I think part of the problem of the idea of a religion for atheists, I mean, literally, because my title has been a little bit misinterpreted as though I was suggesting that we should literally invent a new religion to cater for atheists. I don't mean it like that, because I think that most atheists are too independent-minded. They're not in the mood for joining, something that looks like a kind of stripped-down version of a regular faith. There have been attempts in that direction, but they tend to founder on our individualism. That's not to say that there can't be moments in secular life which can be enriched with some lessons drawn in part from religions. And I think, we're living in a kind of wiki world where the thought of one organized structure lending coherence to a life is just not really that plausible. So we're thinking about things, I'm imagining something that's open-ended and caters to the modern spirit of individualism to an extent. I don't think we need like a new congregation based around the worship of reason or humanity. I think that's not going to work, you're right. But that's not to say that certain moments of religious life and ritual shouldn't be imported in some way.
Okay, but there is, toward the end of the book, there's a kind of suggestion that a certain type of institutional infrastructure is lacking. This is where you talk about, and this is something I could identify with, you talk about kind of the plight of someone who is writing and hoping to have an impact in the very area you're talking about, the kind of meaning of life, or to look at it in less spiritual terms, self-help genre. And you say that it's a tough road to hoe to be an individual. I mean, there's one very depressing line. I would think you would find the sentence depressing. It says, "Books written by lone individuals are not going to do anything." Yes, that's a little hard to take. But you use that as a springboard to say, writers like this. I don't know. You're saying they should sort of unite into some larger structure, right?
Yes. I mean, look. I guess I grew up with a very individualistic, almost romantic philosophy of the writer who leaves behind all organizations, is suspicious of others, and from the top of a mountain delivers books to an expectant world and hopes to change the world. That's the kind of 19th century model of the writer, and we still have it. And that's why writers like you and I are in our studies, going solo, not joining in with others, because the group is contaminated. That's the romantic view of the reasons for the isolation of the writer. I suppose, look, I'm struck by the organizational might of religions. I'm struck by the way that religions often have quite bad ideas about things, but because they are organized, they're able to get the message across. And I'm struck by the amount of people in the secular world who've got some fantastic ideas. There are books out there that detail how one should live in a beautiful, eloquent way, but they're read by 5,000 people and nothing ever happens. Why? Because they're disconnected from power. And so I'm intrigued by this. I think I'm intrigued by the way that there are many good ideas in the modern world. We're not short of good ideas. We're short of ways of making them stick. And more and more, as I grow older, I'm convinced that if we're to make a change in certain areas, you have to join up with others in some kind of a grouping. And that could be changing lots of things. It could be changing, the ethics of school systems, or the way in which, the built environment is constructed, or the way in which parenting is done, or whatever it is. But unless you're prepared to get organized, you won't change anything. And that's, for me, one of the lessons of religions. They've managed to get organized, and through that they've accrued money, they've gathered their intelligence, gathered their might together, and they just have more of an impact. And I think frequently atheists will write books against religion, thinking that a book can destroy religion. And what they're failing to understand is that religions are not just books. Of course, they have books at their center, or near their center, But there are also other things. They're communities, they're restaurants, they're places you sing together, get your laundry done, go on a pilgrimage. There are a whole host of activities. And so long as we venerate the kind of lone writer above anything else, which I think society still does in this area,
I wish.
We're not necessarily going to have much impact. And I contrast. I say that in the modern world, the closest thing to a religion is a multinational corporation. Mm-hmm. But multinational corporations tend not to have any higher ambitions. They're dealing with the body. They're selling us, pizzas and running shoes and that kind of thing. Whereas religions are, of course, trying to have an impact on the ethical inner side of man. And so, I can't help but be struck by this contrast.
But you must believe books have some impact. You keep writing.
Of course I do. But also I try and get organized. I've started a couple of organizations.
Notice you have a website, some kind of school. What is it? Yes. What's the School of Life?
It's the School.
You're the founder of the School of Life?
That's right.
Oh, many people have been looking for you.
Exactly. It's an organization called the School of Life. We've got together and look, in the UK, we're having a nicely big impact, more than I've ever had as a lone writer. It's one classic example. I wrote a book about architecture. I care about good architecture. I realized that a book was, a plausible first move, but I've organized some of my energies into an organization which tries to change things on the ground and, again, has an impact. So, look, it's not the only way, and books, of course, have a very important role, but the very fact that we have this term organized religion should ring a bell in secular people that thought, however important and sound it is, in order to translate into action, requires organization and requires collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You said something earlier that either you said it earlier in this or you said it in your TED Talk or both. You made a reference to some of us kind of just barely holding it together, having trouble getting through life.
Yeah. And
there is in your book a sense of discontent with modern life. A sense of discontent that you think that your book is about addressing in some ways, right? Mm. But I'm just wondering how literally you mean that in your own case, that you're only just holding it together.
Look, I'm struck, like everybody is struck, by the challenges of getting through life. Look, I'm now 42, and certain things are easier and certain things are harder. I'm struck by the lack of structure in life around me. I'm struck by the way that there's a lot of individual searching that doesn't go too well. There's a lot of loneliness with some of these really big questions. And because I'm a writer and I write about these things, people are always coming up to me going, where do we go for this kind of stuff? And where do we find this kind of stuff? People are looking for things, but I'm struck by how disorganized as I say, the transmission of wisdom is. And that both, frightens me and makes me feel there's a role to be played here.
Mm-hmm. And what specific kinds of frustrations or angst or what?
Yeah, I think that, to sum up the angst, we live in developed societies that sell us a vision that happiness is possible, that it is possible to be a contented human being by attacking really the two areas that modern life emphasizes above anything else, which is one, romantic love, and two, work. So we live in a society that's basically focused around love and work. And these two things are actually very important to get right, and possibly dangerous to focus on to the exclusion of everything else. I think individual fulfillment is a very difficult goal to have in mind. The idea that a good life is one where you are happy is a very challenging one, and not necessarily a very wise one. To live for others might actually be better. To recognize the limits of the individual ego and the individual understanding might be wiser. And I'm struck by how religions naturally sell us this. They naturally draw us back from some of the perfectionist, utopian ideals which animate, an average advert or, the spirit of modern society.
But they have an advantage in asserting that you should focus not on happiness, but on, say, the welfare of others, in that they make that claim on the basis of authority. They're talking to people who believe that God commands that. Whereas it might be a tougher sale to make, if you have to just convince people that they'll be happier if they don't pursue happiness. Now, as it happens, I think there's actually some empirical evidence that people who focus on other people and things actually wind up happier themselves. So in that case, maybe you're on stronger ground. But I think in general, I'm just saying an atheist, I think, has a harder sale to make, at least other atheists, in arguing that happiness is not the bottom line.
Yes, I think that's right. Look, I'm struck by how religions are an odd mixture of the optimistic and the pessimistic. They sell us a very optimistic message normally about the next life. Things are going to be great. But when they look at this life, they often look with a particularly clear-eyed gaze on some of the fragilities of the human spirit. If you think about Catholics and original sin, or Buddhists and their analysis of desire and the insatiability of our minds, etc. These are very powerful analyses. And I think there's a slight sentimentality in a lot of the modern world that we don't want to look at the darkness within. But oddly, I personally find it rather cheering to do so. Because once you pick up a Buddhist text or, the book of Job or, Pascal's Pensées, and you have a flick through those, you come back to the modern world and you think, wow, it's not so bad. Or there's a kind of contrast between the optimism which you're sold and the pessimism which is acknowledged in these religious texts. So I think it's about acknowledging the challenges. And I'm very aware that certainly in the United States, and to some extent in the UK too, there are very optimistic ideologies out there that are actually not doing anyone any good. They create what we call the self-esteem problem. Because, if you live in a world where, anything's possible, you're going to have a self-esteem problem on your hands. You're going to have most people think, where have I gone wrong? That pessimistic strand of religion appeals to me.
So life is hard is a message you would like to send.
Life might be hard, and the good thing is that it's not going to be just your life. That actually... and again, what religions do very well is communal gatherings around the darkness of our species. We tend to suffer and go crazy alone, thinking everybody else is fine. I'm just the nutty one. Whereas, of course, religions have this more communal idea that everybody is suffering, that suffering is general. And that's such a useful starting point to get the conversation going and to get people opening up and generally feeling less paranoid.
Yeah. One institution you apply this perspective to is marriage, and the perspective being the benefits of a pessimistic view. You write, the benefits of a philosophy of neo-religious pessimism are nowhere more apparent than in relation to marriage, one of modern society's most grief-stricken arrangements, which has been rendered unnecessarily hellish by the astonishing secular supposition that it should be entered into principally for the sake of happiness.
That's right. Religions start with the idea that we are imperfect. So in Catholicism, the idea is sold to us that we all suffer from original sin. We are all broken. We're all incomplete. I love the notion of original sin as a good atheist could and should. Now, what's going on there in this idea? It's really a recipe for how to have a relationship with another human being. Because if you meet someone and you say, look, both of us are broken, we're likely to be, disturbed in various ways. That's so much better as a starting point than two people who say, look, essentially we're perfect and beautiful looking on the outside and the inside, and then have a horrible collision with reality. So that assumption about our brokenness should not be understood to be a patronizing or guilt-inducing starting point. It should, and it does get us off the hook to some extent for our fragilities.
Mm-hmm. And you think this is an apt description of the actual reality of human nature to some extent. We are bad. We are worse than we think.
Sanity and mental health is a really rare thing and a real achievement. And I'm very influenced by psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis is well on top of these insights as well. It sees the well-being of an individual as an aspiration, not a plausible day-to-day reality, and tends to be relatively downbeat about the possibilities for fulfillment. So, yes, I'm impressed by that cautionary note that you find in religion and psychoanalysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You're down on libertarianism, it sounds like.
Well, I'm skeptical of that notion that advice from another person is always bad. We live in a world where people tend to be absolutely paranoid about influence from outside. The famous refrain nowadays is, "Who are you to tell me how to live?" That's the kind of, it has an adolescent tone, but it continues right through society. One of the most pejorative arguments you can put to a government is to say that is a nanny state. We don't need nannies, is the thing. We're adults. And I'm struck by how on the one hand we think that, and on the other hand we surrender a lot of our public life to commercial organizations who all the time are telling us how to live, what to buy, how to approach things. So we have in our politics an obsession with a kind of libertarianism, and in our commercial life we surrender everything to the free market and think, well, that's fine. It doesn't matter what you watch on TV or what adverts you see or what you're taking in. It's fine. And we think, poor religious societies, they have calls to prayer and authoritarian suggestions, etc. And I think this doesn't quite all add up. I think there are many things that we would probably benefit from being told, all of us. I speak personally, but generally too. I also think that there are ways in which the free market doesn't work at the level of ideas, because it's not a free market. It's a consent for powerful organizations with a commercial agenda to influence us in all sorts of ways. I mean, if you look at television in the United States, does it present truly a free market in the range of ideas that a sensible human being might expose themselves to? No. It's really an exposure to the sorts of ideas that if you have, over, $100 million, you might want to promulgate to an audience for commercial returns. So, I think we already live in quite authoritarian societies. I reject the notion that we are not living in authoritarian society. We already have lots of messages being beamed at us. So often secularists go, we don't want religious messages. That would be corrupting our freedom of maneuver. But I want to go, how much freedom of maneuver do we have anyway? So I'm intrigued by the bossiness of religions. They are bossy. They tell us how often we should call our mothers, literally. I mean, the rules of the Jewish tradition literally will give you rules on, how often we should be in touch with our parents. Extraordinary supposition, really. We tend to think we've worked all that out. No one should tell us that. But it's intriguing to contrast that with a kind of free-for-all of the market societies we live in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to a large extent, you're suggesting that we import some of the insights and practices and wisdom of religion into various other institutions. It could be the university. It could be our own nightly dinners or dinner parties we have. It could be a lot of things. And you are not yourself now starting a religion for atheists. But I assume it would meet with your approval if some atheists started organizations, institutions that aspired to do, in a more all-encompassing sense, what you're saying religions have done, just without the God part. I mean, would you like to see that result from your book?
Absolutely. If a group of, it doesn't even have to be atheists. That's the point. If a group of modern citizens. So if a group of modern citizens got together and said, look, we're going to look at how art is hung. We're going to be influenced by religions. We're going to look at how art is presented. Or we've been influenced by the tradition of religious architecture, and we're going to, put up a building which has learned some lessons from there. Or we're going to look at the way that religions teach ethics, and we're going to try and start a school that, does something a little bit like that, or whatever.
I guess, what about something that was more like a church? In other words, we're going to meet every Sunday or every Saturday, and we're going to have a homily, and we're going to have a moment of feeling gratitude for what we have, and we're going to talk about things like how you confront death or the death of a loved one. We're going to do exactly what religions do.
Yeah, I think the danger with that is that it can appear a bit derivative and like a kind of cliched version. I guess I'm arguing for a slightly more subtle infusion of religiosity into daily life. It doesn't have to imitate it. It doesn't have to be on a Sunday. You used to go to the church down the road, and surprisingly now we've got this new building, and you're going to go to that building. I mean, it doesn't have to be so literal. It can be more metaphorical. It can be more imaginative. But look, sure, some of these things, why not?
Mm-hmm. Have you been in touch with other, kind of famous atheists? Richard Dawkins, some of them were militant atheists. I mean, Christopher Hitchens is no longer with us, but you thank Sam Harris in the acknowledgments.
Yeah.
Have you talked to them about this?
They've look, I had pleasant times with them before this book was published, and slightly less pleasant times with them since. I think that look, some atheists, what we call new atheists, have been surprised, and they have argued to me, both in private and sometimes in a more hostile way in public. They have said, you've come too close to religion. You're just coming too close to something that we really disapprove of. And you're kind of seeming like an apologist for religion, for the enemy, really. And I think that's a pity. I can understand that religion has traumatized many. Religions have done all sorts of terrible things. I'm trying to tread a line. I'm trying to say, look, I am an atheist, a secularist, a non-believer. I'm well aware of all the abuses that religions have, carried out in their name down the centuries. Nevertheless, there should be room for a capacity to appreciate their finer moments, and I think they do have finer moments. But as I say, some atheists have found this really repugnant and have, in strongest terms, protested. And I even received an email the other day going, "You have betrayed atheism." It's a surprising allegation. But the tone has sometimes been, to put it politely, heated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got to say that in my own encounters with some of the new atheists, I debated Sam Harris in Los Angeles not that long ago, and Richard Dawkins was in the front row. And just looking at the response Sam gets, I mean, frankly, there are elements of religion in the new atheism and the following it inspires, and the emotional and frankly, sometimes intellectually uncritical following that it inspires.
Yes, I mean, it's one of the great ironies that, Richard Dawkins in full flight with a certain kind of audience. He's very selective about what he tells different audiences, and he's quite careful. But put him in the right sort of audience and gear him up, he sounds like the most intolerant of fundamentalist preachers. It's particularly ironic because, of course, atheism should be about skepticism and tolerance and, frankly, good manners. And there are blogs out there on the internet. I'm sure you know people like P.Z. Myers. They are deeply aggressive, and they will round up on anyone who they suspect is both claiming a position of non-belief while saying anything in any way polite about believers. And it's just... it's literally ridiculous, and it does no one any favors. It's an insult to the intelligence. I mean, the notion that religions have done only evil across their history is just implausible. We should be able to hold in mind good and evil, and the inability to do that is a sign of a rigid and immature mind.
Okay. Well, this has been great. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the David Brooks interview, which I thought I had around here somewhere. Oh, surely you read David Brooks's interview, and it actually said some very nice things. But in the end, it seemed to me its complaint was that you're not religious.
Yeah, that's
in the traditional sense.
Yes,
right?
That's right. Look, I don't know much about David Brooks. I don't know whether he is himself a religious man. It may be that he is, and that ultimately he just thinks, look, it's all very well, but, sign up to St. Augustine, and there's a mention of St. Augustine there. And I think many religious people have reviewed my book, and they've tended to say the same thing, which is, look, it's very nice to see an atheist who's, giving us some time and is prepared to look at these issues seriously. But there tends to be then in the last paragraph something along the lines of saying, but at the end of the day, you just have to believe. You just can't take this stuff and not believe. And this is where I just have to disagree, as an atheist who has been moved by the New and Old Testament, the music of Bach, and all sorts of other examples of religiosity. I just cannot believe that the choice is either non-belief or belief. That there has to be, the choice has to be either that you don't believe and you disengage from religion, or that you engage with religion but only as a believer. I cannot believe that is the choice. And this is what my book is trying to make a case for. And it's an unusual message. I never expected that it would meet with universal assent or even anything like it. I realized that I'm immediately going to lose two huge sections of the audience, the believers and the rigidly non-believers. And I guess I'm aiming for a kind of middle ground. The people are out there, but it's not necessarily a very vocal constituency.
Not yet, but maybe you'll change that.
Well, exactly. It's in a small way changing the debate.
And I should not say goodbye without actually mentioning that you do touch on Buddhism a little, which is, to my mind, maybe the best example of something that can be fundamentally secular, but really spiritual. I've been to some of these retreats and that were ostensibly not secular, but the truth is you didn't really need all the non-secular part in it. So, there was something... There can be something profound about it taken as a sheerly secular experience. Yes.
I think when I first came across Buddhism, I thought, like many people in the West who, are starting from our kind of starting point, thinking, great, this is what we've been looking for all the time. I'm struck by how Buddhism actually ultimately really is a religion. It promises an afterlife. It has deities capable of all sorts of supernatural feats. It really is a religion. That said, as you say, it is particularly amenable to being separated out from its supernatural elements and used in a more secular context, which is why I think it's been so popular in among secularists.
And in the West, that is happening. An essentially secular version of it is evolving.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Let's show them the book again, including the cool design feature.
Yes. That's right. Very
with the X'd out apple.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think the designer.
I was gonna say you could write a dissertation on the iconography of your jacket. I'm not sure I totally get the X'd out.
I know. I think the designer was trying to fit in about 15 ideas into one jacket, and perhaps a little bit too much.
Well, probably better too many ideas than none at all.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.